December 1812. Across a frozen white landscape, broken carts, dead horses, and abandoned cannons mark the path of Napoleon's retreat. Only months before, Napoleon Bonaparte had marched into Russia with more than 500,000 soldiers, the largest army Europe had ever seen. He had captured Moscow, the city he believed would force Russia to negotiate. Instead, he was retreating through the snow, and his army was disappearing around him. The road behind him stretched back for hundreds of kilometers, covered with the remains of an army that had once seemed unstoppable. For more than 200 years, people have explained this with one simple word: winter. Russian winter destroyed Napoleon's army. But winter did not act alone. Over a century later, another army would march into the same huge territory. It was larger, more heavily armed, and driven by a far more destructive goal. It too expected a quick victory. It too would fail. Centuries before either of them, a third army had already marched into these lands. That army did not fail. It achieved something neither Napoleon nor Hitler would achieve. It took political control, and kept that control for generations. So here is the real question at the heart of this story. Was Russia saved by winter, or by something far larger? Welcome back to EraSpeak. This is the story of Russia. The land created distance. Distance created time. Today, Russia is the largest country on Earth, but that size is a modern fact. The Mongols would come from the east. Napoleon and Hitler would come from the west, where there was no single mountain wall to stop an army, only forests, rivers, and wide-open plains, stretching for thousands of kilometers. But all three invaders faced the same basic fact: the enormous size of the land they were trying to control. Long before the name Russia existed, Slavic communities lived along the region's rivers. In the 9th century, Norse traders known as the Varangians joined this network. According to tradition, Rurik founded a ruling dynasty in the north, and his successor Oleg later took Kiev. These towns grew into the medieval state known as Kievan Rus. Its history is shared by modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. But land alone could save no one. In 1237, a Mongol army led by Batu Khan crossed into these lands. It came from the east, riding fast, and moving in a way European and Rus's armies had never seen before. Ryazan burned first. City after city followed. By 1240, Kiev itself had fallen. This is not a story about a land no one could conquer. It is the opposite. The Mongols proved that this land could be entered and held. But they did not rule the way later invaders would try to rule. By this point, the Mongol Empire already stretched across a huge part of Eurasia. In the decades that followed, it would become the largest empire in history, built from one connected stretch of land. Ruling land this size with soldiers alone was impossible, so the Mongol horde did not station its own soldiers in every town. Instead, it ruled through tribute and through fear. Tribute meant regular payments, a weaker ruler made to a stronger one to avoid being attacked. Local Rus's princes were often allowed to keep their positions. In exchange, those princes collected tribute for the horde and traveled to ask its permission before they were allowed to rule. In time, the western part of the Mongol Empire became known as the Golden Horde. Rus's principalities were small states ruled by princes. In many of them, local rulers continued to manage everyday affairs. as long as tribute was paid and the horde's authority was accepted. This system was very different from what Napoleon and Hitler later expected. They believed a fast military victory would quickly break the government behind the army. This time, the land bought no victory. The conquerors stayed. Over the generations that followed, the princes of Moscow grew more powerful, slowly and unevenly gathering the other Rus' principalities under their own control. At the same time, the Golden Horde itself began breaking apart into rival khanates. By 1480, Grand Prince Ivan III of Moscow had stopped paying regular tribute. He no longer recognized the authority of the Great Horde. One of the states formed as the Golden Horde broke apart. Akhmat Khan, ruler of the Great Horde, marched toward Muscovy to restore that authority. For weeks, his forces and Ivan's faced each other across the Ugra River. Small fights, failed river crossings, but no single great battle. With the reinforcements he expected still absent, winter approaching, and conditions growing more difficult, Akhmat finally withdrew. Historians still debate the details, but the standoff at the Ugra River is remembered as the moment Horde rule over these lands finally ended, not through one dramatic battle, but through tension, limited fighting, and a long retreat. The Horde had ruled through tribute and fear for almost 2.5 centuries. 3 centuries after this standoff, another invader would demand something completely different: surrender. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia to force Tsar Alexander I back into his economic blockade against Britain. Russian commanders repeatedly retreated, destroying supplies his army would need. At Borodino, Napoleon won the battlefield, but not the surrender he needed. The Russian army pulled back again. Napoleon entered an almost empty Moscow, and fires spread through the city that night. Still, Alexander refused to negotiate. The retreat became a disaster. At the Berezina, Napoleon's engineers saved much of his remaining organized force, but thousands of soldiers and civilians were lost. Russia also paid heavily. Armies suffered terrible losses, civilians fled, and entire regions lost homes and supplies. The land bought time. The people paid for it. It would take one more empire, more than a century later, to learn the very same lesson, at a far greater cost. In June 1941, Nazi Germany and its allies launched Operation Barbarossa. More than 3.5 million men crossed into Soviet territory, one of the largest invasion forces in all of history. German commanders expected the Soviet Union to collapse within weeks. This was not only a military invasion. Nazi leaders planned to destroy the Soviet state, take its land, and kill, starve, or drive away millions of its people. Stalin had received repeated warnings that an invasion was coming. He distrusted many of them, and Soviet forces were not fully prepared for the speed and the enormous size of the attack. The early losses were disastrous. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed within weeks. By early December 1941, German forces had reached positions only a few dozen kilometers from central Moscow. It was the closest they would ever get. And right there, near Moscow, the advance finally stopped. The popular story credits winter alone for stopping Hitler. But the fuller truth is more complicated than that. German planning had badly underestimated how many soldiers and machines the Soviet Union still had left. Whole Soviet factories were taken apart, moved eastward, and restarted where German forces could not reach them. the same tactic Russia used against Napoleon, destroying supplies as troops retreated, and supply lines stretched to their limit by huge distances, wore the German war machine down long before the coldest weather arrived. And the counterattacks that followed were planned and carried out by people, not by the weather. Cold punished Germany's failures. It did not, by itself, create the Soviet Union's victory. Stalingrad became one of the true turning points of the whole war. In a Soviet operation called Uranus, the Red Army surrounded and trapped most of Germany's Sixth Army, together with other Axis units. The remaining Sixth Army forces surrendered in February 1943. After Stalingrad, Germany made one last major attempt to take back the advantage at Kursk, in a battle involving thousands of tanks on both sides. That offensive also failed. From that point, the strategic direction of the war increasingly turned westward, and stayed that way for the rest of the fighting. As it continued, Allied aid from Britain and the United States brought trucks, food, railway equipment, and raw materials. This aid did not replace the Soviet Union's own enormous military and industrial effort, but it became an important part of the supply effort that carried Soviet forces westward. In 1945, Soviet forces finally reached Berlin. The war in Europe ended that May. The Soviet Union carried an enormous share of the war against Nazi Germany. Its total losses were almost impossible to imagine. An estimated 24 to 27 million soldiers and civilians from Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and many other Soviet republics. Few communities escaped the effects of the war. Few families did, either. The land bought time. The people paid for it. 3 invasions. 3 very different outcomes. The Mongols succeeded through force, tribute, and indirect rule. They allowed local princes to keep governing their own people, as long as those princes accepted the horde's authority above them. That allowed the horde to control the Rus's principalities without directly governing every town itself. Napoleon showed the world that occupying Moscow was not enough to force Russia to surrender. Hitler showed something even bigger, that occupying enormous stretches of Soviet territory still could not destroy the state standing behind it. Napoleon and Hitler invaded with much larger armies and more destructive weapons than the Mongols had possessed. But their political goals were different. Napoleon needed Alexander to negotiate and return to the blockade against Britain. Hitler intended to destroy the Soviet state and conquer its territory permanently. The horde, centuries earlier, had used a different system. After its first violent conquest, it demanded tribute and obedience, while allowing local princes to continue governing many of their own lands. That system did not make Mongol rule peaceful, but it allowed the horde to hold power without directly ruling every town and village. Napoleon and Hitler followed different strategies, but both expected battlefield success to produce a quick political result. That result never came. Geography alone did not win these wars. It created time, and it created space. But it did not decide how that time would be used. Leaders made decisions. Soldiers fought. Workers kept factories running, and civilians lived through invasion, occupation, and being forced from their homes. Their actions and sacrifices shaped the outcome, and millions of people paid the price. So, across these 3 invasions, how much did geography really shape what happened? And how much depended on human decisions instead? Leave your answer in the comments below. If you want to know more about Napoleon's own rise and fall, we already told that story. The hunger that carried him all the way to power and then slowly destroyed him. Go watch it after this one. And if you're learning English through history, subscribe to EraSpeak for more stories from every corner of the past. The land created distance. Distance created time. But human choices decided what that time would mean, and human lives paid the price.